Okay, so our fourth and final week on the book of Genesis, and tonight we'll cover 13 chapters. Unlike last week, we won't quite have the chance to look at every single chapter's material, but we're really going to try to hit the good salient points, and we will read rather large portions of the text we're working with tonight. And just to remind everyone who gets a chance not only to come in here and listen to this in person, but for anyone who may have a chance to tap into it in the future, the reason why we're looking at the Torah in this way is more or less a means of giving you an interpretive lens or set of tools to help you better understand if you were to do a much more in-depth, a verse-by-verse, perhaps chapter-by-chapter expositional study, which who knows, maybe in the future something like that could be made available to us, but naturally it's going to require several lessons, probably well over 75 to 100 videos to really walk through the text and do it any measure of justice. So this could help us by setting some guideposts in place and help us understand what's really going on in the background and prevent us from bringing any particular bias or baggage into the way that we interpret the narrative. So we're not just simply trying to dice up the text and look at it in a forensic but yet cold manner in which it's not dynamic, it's not really meant to affect us in a positive way. Naturally, anytime we approach the Scripture, we want to approach it in such a way as to humbly expose ourselves to it so that we can be transformed and hear the word of the Lord and as His voice as He ultimately speaks to us. So that's what we're shooting for. If you've joined in the previous 3 sessions and you're still wondering why in the world are we doing it like this, that is the reason why. And I won't say much more on that with every single lesson that we've got coming, because next week we're going to jump into the book of Exodus. But hopefully this has been a decent introduction into the Torah. So with that in mind, we're jumping right on into the Joseph story. But a slide that I think that at this point we're all kind of familiar with, and that is identifying some patterns. We have seen this slide before, but I reworked it a little bit just to show you what material it is that we're diving into tonight. So remember last week we discussed in Genesis 25, picking up with Abraham's death, and then paralleling that with Isaac's death 10 chapters later. We walked through the way that the author of the text is breaking it down further and implementing something of a pattern by then showing us a genealogy. And the reason why is because there's a particular son who had an important place in the story, but just to drive home the point that God, while merciful, and blesses that particular son, and in these instances of Ishmael and Esau, winds up making nations of them. Maybe not so much with Esau as goes giving him a particular land to dwell in, as will be the case with Esau, but nonetheless, they wind up becoming great nations, at least in the sense that they proliferate, their people spread. But then, as we also continue to dive a little deeper into that pattern, we realize after the giving of Ishmael's genealogy, we see clearly who the actual covenant heir is to the promise that God made with Abraham in Genesis 12, as Isaac takes front and center stage of the story. We go to Genesis 35, we see Esau's genealogy being given, and of course he's the son that is cast off. And then the next thing we should expect, if this pattern holds true, is a confirmation of who exactly the heir apparent is. But the difference is that while we have a glance in Genesis 25 of the 6 other sons through a different wife that Abraham had, nothing is spoken of with respect to them outside of that. Now, Ishmael, obviously being Abraham's firstborn, as I said, has a more prominent place in the story. And so this pattern is set there for us to better understand the fact that God has identified who the covenant heir is. Now, with Jacob, on the other hand, it's not as simple because he doesn't have 2 sons as his father Isaac did, and it's a 50-50 toss-up that's already been determined before the boys have been born. So for the reader's sake, and from our vantage point, it's not a toss-up. We know it's going to be Jacob before the boys are ever born. But it seems, as we kind of teased out last week, maybe Isaac wasn't brought up to speed on that. Maybe Rebekah never really told him that. We have no record of the Lord divulging that to him. And so upon what he perceived to be his deathbed, He's proceeding with what he thinks is the right maneuver, and that's to make Esau that particular covenant heir, but it winds up being Jacob through a manipulative ploy. Then we get into Jacob's story. And now, as we've kind of walked through the text a little bit, at this point, given Esau's genealogy, we would expect an identification of who amongst Jacob's heirs is going to be the one to carry this covenant promise. And this is where things kind of get a little interesting, because the next chapter after that starts the Joseph story in Genesis 37. But there is no genealogy given there. In fact, it won't be until Genesis 38, and we have this weird little interlude where in chapter 37, we've got Joseph and him being introduced into the story as a teenager. And then after that, by the end of the chapter, he is being sold into slavery. But before we pick up with him leaving for Egypt, over in 38, we have him in Egypt now, in Potiphar's house. Sorry, that's 39. I'll get right here in a second. In 39, in Potiphar's house. But in 38, we've got this weird little interlude where now we're talking about Judah and his little story with death of his wife and him taking a new wife and then having sons and their sons are doing bad things and the oldest two being put to death by the Lord and so on. And by the end of the chapter, we do have a little bit of a genealogy and a story that parallels the birth narrative of Jacob and Esau. So you juxtapose Rebekah's story of how she gave birth to the twins and the struggle that she had, and the same thing with respect to Tamar with Judah's twins and the struggle that she had. I say struggle, definitely not life-threatening per se, but nonetheless, in the process, both with Jacob and Esau and with Perez and Zerah, we have an identification of who exactly the covenant heir is going to be. So all that to simply explain, as we're starting in chapter 37, why chapter 38 is where it is. And I think identifying this pattern is a decent way of trying to look at that and get a better feel for why the author just in this weird way breaks away from the Joseph story to give us this little snippet of Judah and then jumps back into the Joseph story in chapter 39. All right, so moving beyond that. Here we go, right into the heart of our story. So turn with me to chapter 37, and we are going to read verses 3 through 11. Chapter 37, 3 through 11. Now Israel, we all understand that is Jacob, but more frequently through this story than in other stories that involve this character, he is going to be referred to as Israel, as opposed to his original or former name, Jacob. Israel loved Joseph more than all of his other sons because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age, and he made a long-sleeved robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. When Joseph had a dream, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. There we were, binding sheaves of grain in the field, and suddenly my sheaves stood up. Your sheaves gathered round it and bowed down to my sheaf." And they said, "Are you really going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule us?" So they hated him even more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream and told it to his brothers. "Look," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." He told his father and brothers, and his father rebuked him. "What kind of dream is this that you've had?" he said. "Am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So I would assume that all of us are familiar enough with the story that we probably could, if we needed to, pull out a sheet of paper and just write down the details of these stories cold without being able to peruse the biblical text, just double check and make sure we've got it all down. We probably could easily identify these things as we've heard the more Sunday school versions of these stories most of our collective lives. But to break it down a little bit and get a feel for why the narrative flow is going the way that it is, let's take a look at the first dream, paralleling the two together. And we should come to understand by the end of Joseph's story arc, or at least the first half of his story arc, that this in and of itself becomes something of a pattern. Have you ever stopped to think about that? Joseph gets two dreams. The next time we have Joseph doing anything whatsoever discussing dreams, it's in the context of who? Who's there? Whose dreams is he interpreting? Cupbearer and the baker. And because there's two and they each have their own dream, we have how many dreams? Okay. And so then after that, he interprets someone else's dreams. And that person would be, and how many dreams does Pharaoh actually have? Two. We would say, well, it's the same dream, but in reality, it's two separate dreams. They mean the same thing. So these doublets are there for an intentional reason. I would also add that there's 2 years that pass between the time of the incident of Joseph having this dialogue with cupbearer and baker. That's not coincidental. But that aside, to back up the nerdiness just a little bit, this is where it all kind of begins. And it starts with sheaves of grain, which we come to understand are Joseph's brothers. They immediately identify that for us. We don't have to be presumptive because that's what they take it to mean as soon as he divulges to them what the dream is. In neither of these particular dream sequences does he even take it upon himself to attempt to try to interpret for them what it means. They circle around a central sheaf, which he then understands to be himself, and by virtue of the fact that they bow down to him, then they come away with a clear understanding that this is to signify that somehow Joseph is going to ascend to some position of authority, at least in his own mind, according to this dream that he had. None of them can vouch for, testify to, or shared in as part of divine revelation, and not to think that any of them would have even thought such a thing to begin with. Now, remember, consider this. Back in Genesis chapter 1, we've got the ideal, and that is God making man in his image. And we're going to speak a little bit more on that and what exactly that means as this lesson progresses. But making man in his image, in our likeness, and they will rule the whole earth. Considering that then, and what this story is ultimately going to bear out for us, so I'm going to spoil that a little bit now, and that is getting a better synopsis of what the ideal image bearer of God that we are anticipating as the narrative flow of Scripture and its trajectory continues to move in the progressive way that it will. Okay? In other words, we started in the Genesis creation story with God making an image bearer who reflects his likeness in every way he is intended to. And then after we get past Genesis chapter 3 with the way that he consciously rebels against God, that image becomes marred in some way. That picture is never fully realized in this ideal way again until Jesus comes onto the scene. And we have several characters in this massive interlude that covers thousands of years between Genesis and the advent of the New Testament age and the gospel narrative itself, correct? And with that, we see people who seemingly fit the mold in some ways, but none of them ever truly aspire to bring all of the pieces back together as one cohesive whole. All right? So, having said that, with this in mind, Joseph's first dream is more or less terrestrial based because we have sheaves of grain, something they deal with regularly. In fact, it will be later on in this sequence when Joseph is betrayed by his brothers. This is what he finds them doing out there, tending to these sorts of things, whether it's husbandry and taking care of flocks and herds, or binding sheaves of grain, or doing whatever is necessary to sustain the family. So the ideal image is for man to rule with God's authority, bringing order and complexity to God's creation alongside him as a partner. This is not something we glean or ascertain from Joseph's dream. This is something that has already been established for us in the text in chapter 1, moving in this direction. The first thing perhaps that we should be asking with respect to this, considering that we've had nothing like this in the entire Genesis story, is what in the world is God doing here? Why is he giving this man dreams? There's not a single character up until this point that God has revealed in any way, shape, or form, any information as part of a revelation through a dream sequence. We've had visions, sure, but not dreams. You might ask, what's the difference? And that's a different conversation in and of itself, and the whole theology is wrapped around such a thing. But that aside, nobody that God has talked to in this way. And better yet, when we're talking about the idea of kingship, we've had sparse moments of dialogue where God has promised to Abraham in Genesis 12 this concept of making him a great nation and blessing all families. And then as this promise develops more through subsequent chapters of 15 and 17, especially in 17, God speaks of kings coming from this man. But at this point, they're hardly a group of people that number more than just several dozen. 60s probably at this point, because maybe some of those people that we hear or find record of in Genesis 50, not by name but just by number, of a group of 70 that move down or migrate from Canaan into Egypt. Some of them probably haven't even been born yet, so it may be even as low as 50. No one would consider such a thing a nation, and so at best this person can be considered an elder, probably not even a chieftain necessarily, certainly not a king. So why these images or dreams of grandeur and this concept of ruling when it just seems like the concept and the story and the family, all of these things have not developed enough for us to arrive at that particular moment? Okay? Then he has a second dream, and now it's totally different. But notice the way that these are mentioned. Sun, moon, and stars. It's kind of a hyperlink if you think about it, because why exactly mention them in that order? We can contrive in our mind, well, the sun is the bigger luminary and the moon the smaller one, and stars obviously smaller than that in the night sky, whether we're bringing into that a 21st century scientific understanding of what these actual heavenly luminaries are made of and how they operate, or even trying to put ourselves in the position of the ancients. But we're drawing from the text. Where have we seen this grouping before of sun, moon, and stars? Creation, chapter 1, when God fills this space that he has made with these heavenly luminaries, sun, moon, and stars. Now, we take this in parallel as understanding because of what Jacob winds up saying when he hears this, that we presume him being the sun, the greater luminary, and his mother, maybe his mother's dead at this point, as that part of the narrative is already passed for us, but nonetheless, that's what Jacob is taking it as. And then, of course, the 11 stars really couldn't mean anything other than his 11 brothers. So I think it would be right to say it's his family. Joseph does not say, as he does in the previous dream sequence, about them bowing down to him necessarily as a luminary. Joseph talks about himself as a sheaf in the previous dream sequence. He doesn't mention what he is in this. So is it possible that he's even greater than the sun? Again, we don't know. That's left out for us. The assumption would have to be that they are prostrating down to another luminary. But here's the thing. If you're putting the image in your mind, how does the sun bow? How does the moon bow? How do stars bow down? Any concept? We would immediately can resign ourselves to say, well, this is completely metaphorical in nature. I mean, we don't have to actually imagine them as having limbs by which they can prostrate themselves. I'm going to say this, understanding that, it might be a little on the taboo side. In fact, it was in this particular room where I had somebody in a jokingly way say, you say something like that in a Baptist church, and you're probably going to wind up getting laughed out of the place, if not carried out of there, for saying something like that. It might be seen as a little out there, maybe even somewhat heretical. But to treat it as if it's not there is to just be flat out disrespectful of the text. As we have many, many things laid down for us in the book of Genesis, what we are actually seeing here is something of the roots being established for what is a conversation that is happening in the text, but at various places and in a really sparse manner in the way that it is, and that is the concept of the divine council. That these beings are known as the Binha Elohim. Many of us never really start contemplating Hebrew names for God, but for any of us who've ever actually done something of a word study in a group setting or heard someone preach on it, perhaps formally, usually this gets used simply as a name for God, and then we leave it there. Just much in the same that we could shorten that up to El or expand it out with other suffixes such as El Shaddai or El Elohe or various other things. One thing that is often completely unbeknownst to us, and therefore it never hardly gets mentioned outside of the realms of academia, is the fact that oftentimes we have a tendency to write this with the capital rendering, but in most cases in the Bible, it's written with the lowercase rendering. And the idea is that this is collectively speaking about more than just one particular being. In fact, when we go back to Genesis 1 and verse 26 and we hear that word or phrase being said, as it's up on the screen for you, let us make man in our own image. How many in here render that as the Father speaking in union with the Son and the Holy Spirit as this Trinitarian concept of God being who is making the decision to make man in his image. We do so because we bring the language of the New Testament to bear on this. But what we fail to understand is we are missing out on everything else that the Scripture has to say with respect to the idea of there being a divine council, a whole array of beings, not as gods per se, but a whole array of beings that God assumes to take counsel amongst and share power and authority with. And so taboo in the sense that perhaps, number one might think Genesis isn't a place to mention that, but this is where we would formulate such an idea as far as its origins. Number two, because I don't have the time to expound upon it much further than that, that would be a lesson for another time or another day. But it has significance to bear with respect to what this dream means, because it has a wider and a more expanded meaning than just the idea of what Jacob takes it to be, and that is, so we, the family, are to bow down to you. Because the larger context in play here is the ideal image bearer. Because what this whole story sequence of Joseph is really about is before we get to the end of Genesis, with all the questions that are left out there in the realm of ambiguity as to how exactly is Abraham's family supposed to bless all the families of the world. And granted, kings might come from this man, but when and at what point is kingship going to come? And how are they going to expand beyond the realm of their own genealogical descent to include other families that have walked away from God or are not part of their particular tribe or people group because of the covenant of circumcision and things like that? God is giving them that ideal scenario of what his kingdom is going to look like and how it's going to function before they actually get into the real concept of that kingdom and what it will look like in the land of Canaan. Because remember, this story takes place almost primarily in the land of Egypt. And we're going to develop that a little here tonight. But as we're talking about the ideal image bearer and how the Scripture is going to unpack this thought more and more and more, this hopefully begins to free our minds from the constraints of the idea of Jesus ruling and reigning on a throne in Jerusalem as the consummation of kingdom. Because the consummation of kingdom is what the reality of it is now, and that is the Daniel 7 vision of a Son of Man riding on the clouds of heaven, as only God can do, being pulled into the very presence of the Ancient of Days. And oh, by the way, as goes this concept of divine counsel, when Daniel begins this vision, does he not say that he sees thrones arrayed before him? Not just a single throne, but thrones. Who are occupying the other thrones outside of the one that the Ancient of Days sits upon? Such a question would also begin to titillate our curiosity centers when we go to a place like 1 Kings 22, with Ahab and Jehoshaphat, kings of Israel and Judah, sitting in council with each other, trying to discern the will of the Lord. At least Jehoshaphat is. Ahab could care less. He's talked to his court-appointed prophets, and they have assured him of victory. Jehoshaphat needs more assurance because he wants to hear from a prophet who's obedient to Yahweh. And so Micaiah is the only one that Ahab will go to because, of course, he and Elijah are not on speaking terms. And when Micaiah enters the picture, Micaiah says, when they finally get to the quick of things, that he was there listening to the divine counsel of the Lord as the Lord was taking advice from those who he shares his authority with as to who amongst you are going to go and deceive Ahab into going into battle against the king of Aram Damascus. You ever wondered about that? Or maybe Daniel chapter 11 and this concept of who exactly is the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, these principalities that Paul is talking about in his letter to the churches in Ephesus. This is a whole background conversation that many of us are very unfamiliar with, and in some cases it makes us uncomfortable to think about. But the idea is that this divine image bearer, who we're starting to see somewhat take shape a little bit in this Joseph story, and is going to be greatly expounded upon once we get to places like Daniel 7, is one who will reign cosmically at the right hand of the Father. In other words, what I'm saying is the next time you read Daniel 7, maybe this concept from Genesis 37 and this vision or dream that Joseph had of sun, moon, and stars bowing down to him will creep into your mind as a picture of Jesus' cosmic rule as the divine image bearer. It's a glimpse at the incarnational idea of man's rule being exalted to the seat of power held only by the Elohim over all Elohim. So with that in mind, I think this will be a good moment for a pause and some questions to make sure that if I've said anything that has muddied up the waters, that we clear it up.
Would you consider the serpent to be a divine being?
Yes, in every way, because this is another thing that oftentimes we really never take glance at because we only read the Bible in English. None of us here are fluent in Hebrew, certainly not at the realm of scholarship. And so with that in mind, if we're reading the text in English, all we're given is serpent. But if we go back to the actual Hebrew word of nakash that is rendered as serpent, in more cases than not, it is rendered as shining thing or one or just simply shiny. Sometimes it's even translated as bronze, depending upon what exactly is being described. This, again, is part of the pitfall of us just simply reading the Bible in English and failing to do lexical studies. But then again, not a lot of us have the time for such levels of nerddom. But that aside, when you consider the idea that it's not really speaking about the concept of some what potentially could have been prehistorically a four-legged reptilian creature that possessed the ability to talk, but was perhaps one of these divine beings that shared in the space of the prototypical temple garden that was Eden, per our conversations in these last few weeks, that this very well may be the moment that we see the rebellion of who becomes the Satan, or in Hebrew, the Satan. That is a title. It is not a name. He is the adversary, the accuser. He goes by various other things, but the Satan is a role to be played, and it is occupied by a divine being. And that is perhaps given us most clearly in Job chapter 1, when the sons of God, the Binha Elohim, come to present themselves before the Lord, and the Satan is amongst them. So we always theorize this concept of there had to be some great spiritual rebellion before God began the events of Genesis chapter 1 and creation week. There's nothing in the Bible that tells us such. And so it's possible we are witnessing the very fall of said creature in the garden when he is tempting the man and the woman to consciously rebel against God.
Yes, on top of that, would you say that there are passages that talk about how Israel is God's chosen portion and how the other nations are the allotment essentially of the divine council of the gods. So would you say that maybe rather than the idea that there was some spiritual fall of these angels, that God allowed the other members of the divine council, et cetera, to rule over those nations in order to put on display what his people are like, in order to reclaim all the nations to himself and to display his glory, sort of like in Egypt, where he says that, I will have glory, I will gain glory over the gods of Egypt.
Yes, I would say, in conjunction with Toby's question, the idea of the possibility of some passages alluding to the idea of there being a hierarchy of principates, these divine beings that God has basically sliced up the map post-Babel and has given those nations over to these divine beings to rule. Reference points would be Deuteronomy 32. So when we get the chance to look at Moses' song, once we get there, we'll tear this up a little bit more, but also Psalm 89. And of course, as is the case with lots of lofty things like this still continues to excite scholars that debate over who is the subject point of reference. But another text, as I've already mentioned, Daniel 11, that gets brought into this, because it seems like with this angel who brings the message to Daniel, talking about how he was interrupted in that concourse of bringing this message to him by these principates known as the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece. If they are at odds with this messenger preventing them, it would certainly suggest the idea that they perhaps are principates who have not only abandoned their particular post, but have outright rebelled against God. And so if that's the case, we would have to ask the questions, when did these things happen? If God turned the nations, divided up at the exile of the nations at Babel, Genesis 11, over to these divine beings that are represented by the sun, moon, and stars. The poetic language of the Psalter, I was about to say the Psalms, the Psalter, which is the Psalms, makes no bones about that. If you dive into the text, this is exactly what it's referencing, and not just using metaphorical language. Am I saying that the way that the Greeks, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, and all were worshiping these beings were right in their thinking of there actually is a divine being with a humanoid visage that represents the sun? No, of course not. I'm just saying this is how it's represented in the biblical text. I can't speak too much more than that because we're peering into things that we don't really understand and are not further defined for us in the Bible. But we have to recognize the reality of said speech. So with that in mind, is it possible that after he assigned them the nations that they would govern over, did some of them rebel? That is a possibility. Is it possible that what we're talking about as goes principates who array themselves against God's divine beings, the Binha Elohim, are demons, divine beings that had rebelled prior to the creation of man? All of these are possible, viable options. And we don't have a smorgasbord of text to bring in support of one opinion over the other. We just have to kind of talk about what we know and then leave the rest up to some manner of speculation. But at the same time, this theme, this concept is peppered all throughout Scripture, not only in Genesis, but we find the very same concept going on in the book of Revelation as well. But anything else? All right, turn with me, 37 again, and we'll find our place in verses 23 through 28. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's robe, the long sleeve robe that he had on. Then they took him, they threw him into the pit. The pit was empty without water. They sat down to eat a meal, and when they looked up, there was a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying aromatic gum, balsam, and resin, going down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When Midianite traders passed by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the pit, sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph to Egypt. So here's what we need to get up front as we're being immersed into the story just a little bit deeper, is a picture that's not going to give us the complete total payoff, but definitely be expounded upon before we get to the end of this book a lot more, but is going to have the ultimate sense of payoff when we get to the first 12 chapters of the successive book, what we'll be talking about next week. But we need to get a good understanding of the symbolism of which the nation of Egypt is so intricately tied to as goes the biblical narrative. Because again, Egypt will be a reference point in many parts of the Scripture. It will be the things that prophets speak about when they reference the great redemptive act of the Lord. It will be the things that they speak about also with respect to points of judgment, not only for Egypt's horizon from the point in which they're talking about these things, but they're also speaking about what God had done in Egypt as a picture of what God is now going to do to his own people because of their treachery and rebellion. So considering the fact that the author doesn't have to share any detail with us whatsoever, when details are put in there, we should be asking questions as opposed to just simply saying, hey, I guess it's great that he put in there that they were carrying these things down to Egypt. They are nomadic people, so apparently they are caravanning from one place to another for the sake of selling these wares and earning their keep or trade or whatever. And that would be absolutely right. But the detail that's being put in there for us is simply the fact that these particular things, gum, balsam, what you may have in your translation might be myrrh. These are all ingredients that are used as funerary components for making embalming fluid. So if we're thinking that, if we've grasped onto that, maybe you've never heard of that before, but now that you have, considering that they are carrying the things that are used ritualistically for a cult that an entire nation is somewhat built around, because everything that happens in Egypt, from the rising of the sun to its setting, deals with the concept of the afterlife and everything that is going to be done in preparation for everyone who gets the chance to enter into said afterlife. And of course, the Pharaoh at the top of that pyramid has the best chance at the greatest enjoyment of what will come in the afterlife, because he gets, for later dynasties of pharaohs, a pyramid, a whole chamber to himself, filled with intricate articles of gold and silver, various other offerings. Early pharaohs would actually undergo the practice of having their entire court put to death when they died. Imagine being the queen and you've still hopefully got some longevity left, but your husband died unexpectedly of a battle injury or some unforeseen disease. And as opposed to getting married to somebody else, you get to join him in the afterlife. So you have to submit to ritualistic suicide, right along with the chief steward and everybody else that attended to the king in life, because the expectation is every night this king is going to come back to this place. He is going to walk around in this chamber you've made for him, and everybody else is going to need to continue to minister and attend to Pharaoh the way that they did in life, so in death. So the whole entire system of civilization itself is bent around this, considering the idea that the kingdom itself is a cultic death practice. What does that tell us about Egypt? In essence, Egypt is the land of the dead. And so when you look at phrases like the camels were carrying these things and they were going down to Egypt, again, where English sells us short is that we fail to realize that the words translated going down from the Hebrew yarad means descend. Now you and I might think, I jump on the highway and I move in a southerly fashion. I'm descending from here down to Baton Rouge or wherever you're planning on heading to. That's not generally the idea. Again, the world for the most part is, at least in biblical terms, arrayed like this. The divine mountain. To descend would mean to go down, to literally fall. That's the idea. So the concept here would be the idea of going from the place where God has blessed this people and bringing them to a land that he promised them and where their future and destiny lies, to leave that place and to go to a place where now, symbolically speaking, it is to descend unto death. In fact, when we get to the bottom of this chapter, what we have here basically is when these brothers bring their half-spun story back to their father over what happened to their brother, leaving out the fact they sold him into slavery and painting the picture that he was mauled by some wild animal. And here's the evidence, the shredded up coat covered in goat's blood. That now Jacob says, after he refuses to be comforted, no, I will go down to Sheol. I will descend, Yarad, into Sheol. Sheol is the grave, the realm of the dead, where all dispossessed spirits, at least that's the way they were thinking of it then, would go and occupy after they leave this life. I will descend there to my son, who is also descended unto Sheol, and I will do so in mourning. Sheol is the Hebrew word that represents the grave, and so by metaphor and means of extending it, then we look back at what has been said here about Jacob or Joseph going down to Egypt as him descending unto the grave. Does that make sense? And then by the end of the book, we have the same thing, because in chapter 50, it begins with what is mentioned for us at the end of 49, and that is Jacob giving this long and drawn-out apocalyptic vision of what will befall his people in the days to come, speaking about the end of time. And then, moving on into chapter 50, he has died. Now he's going to be embalmed. These very things are going to be pumped into his body. And by the end of chapter 50, the end of the book, the whole thing concludes with Joseph speaking prophetically about God visiting them in the day of their need, but he too dies and is embalmed. He, as Jacob says, I will descend unto Sheol where my son is. His son is in Egypt. By the end of the story, so is Jacob. Jacob says prophetically, I will go to Sheol where my son is, and by the end of this whole book, that is exactly where both of them are found. But I have titled this slide, Glimpsing Messiah, by understanding first the picture of Egypt. So we can see clearly, and I don't think it's escaped anybody's attention in here, in whatever study you've done or been exposed to of these portions of Genesis, that there's no doubt about the fact Joseph is a very good glimpse at what the Messiah will be like as the story will progress and we'll eventually get there. There's really not a concept being built here in the minds of the people of a Messiah figure, because we haven't gotten to the words of Isaiah, who speaks of the king who will come from the line and broken house of David through Jesse, or the prince that is David, their shepherd, that Ezekiel talks about. Clear messianic language. But it all finds its roots in places like this, because these become the archetypal images of who and what Messiah will be. This Messiah figure captured here in Joseph is one who, get this, will taste death first for the new nation or the humanity that will come from his people, because Joseph ends this story for us in Genesis with all of the nation down in Egypt. They're not a nation yet, but by the time they leave the womb of Egypt, they are a nation. What was not a nation that descended into the realm or land of the dead is born from it anew, as indeed a new nation. And the first of them to go down there in this migratory pattern is Joseph, the Messiah figure. What do we find in the New Testament? Is that not what Jesus has done? The greater expansion of the Joseph figure in the New Testament gospel narratives, that he is the one who tastes death first for the new humanity and the new nation that will come from him. We've seen this slide before, but notice how some of these things are actually popping up for us in this particular chapter, because as the woman saw the tree and that the fruit was desirable, so when his brothers saw him at a distance, they immediately, as in Cain's fashion, plot to kill him. They strip off his robe. They take him, because when the woman's eyes were laid upon the object of her desire, that's exactly what she moves toward, with the agenda in mind of what she is going to gain from it. And the brothers hope to rid themselves of this terrible spawn of the Satan that has been conceived by their father and his mother, because none of them share the same mother as him. They can't wait to be rid of him. And then, of course, we have the undertones of exile with the idea of God sending them away from the garden. And the Cain story, of course, Cain is sent away as a restless wanderer. Joseph is consigned to exile by virtue of the fact that when the caravan takes control of him through the exchange of money, they exile him, as it were, down into the land of the dead. But as we've seen these patterns before, let's start to notice something new, shall we? Diverting destruction. So walk with me through the busyness on the screen here, going all the way back to the beginning of the entire book, creation. And with creation, we've got the temple paradise and the image-bearing king priest in the garden. But sin creeps into the garden. And over the next 5 chapters or so on into Genesis 6, and of course that story ends in Genesis 9, humanity continues to spiral out of control, their sin proliferates exponentially, and God brings this final form of judgment in the flood. But with that, as seen here with the blue arrow, God has taken what has gone into the complete realm of negative, no positive, except for the remnant of this people he chooses to save, and he brings good from it. That good is a new creation in the sense of a refurbished earth with a new image-bearing king priest in the person of Noah upon it. But as that story progresses over into Genesis 11, we have sin in the garden again. Now it's in the form of rebellion at Babel, which results in the nations going into exile. But God calls Abraham, a new Adam-like figure who is an image-bearing king priest, and he promises a new paradise, a provincial Eden, where eventually we're going to get an actual representation of Eden with the tabernacle, right? But as that story progresses, we have the abuse of Hagar and him manipulating the circumstances of the promise and attempting to try to get a son without waiting faithfully on the Lord. And because of these sequences of their abuse of Hagar, it results in her running away twice, which ultimately ends in her and the boy being exiled away from the family. Even with God's permission, it's not good. The family's fractured. Wouldn't you agree? So that part of the family is in exile. But with that, we have the new bearer of the covenant, or the heir apparent, who's continuing this whole new Adam, image-bearing king priest in a new paradise motif. And as we work through his story, there are some not so bright moments, but more importantly, through what we've worked through, we get into the Jacob concept. And when Jacob comes along, his deception results in him being exiled from the land. He's got to run away from Esau, because if not, Esau's going to kill him. He has taken a vow to do so. But God brings good from it, because ultimately, as God has promised he would bring him back from this place, Padan Aram, where Rebekah's extended family is, 20 plus years later, that's eventually what winds up happening. He goes away, essentially a poor man with nothing but the clothes on his back and maybe a few coins in his pocket if they were using such things back then. And now he comes back with flocks, herds, and a huge, massive family. The guy is rich. God has brought good from this because now he is going to expand that family even more in the land of promise, which brings us to the brink of where we are now. And this family plots to kill Joseph, to do the same thing that Cain was attempting to do and was successful at right outside the garden, in spite of God's intervention in the story. And this results also in the family in exile, does it not? Because Joseph winds up in exile, and for all intent and purpose, to his brothers, he's dead. They won't find out he's still alive until 20 plus years later. And then, by the end of the entire Genesis arc, we have the whole family in exile. Now, yeah, Genesis 46, you've got God meeting with Jacob at Beersheba, the southernmost point in the land. And as he is burning a sacrifice to the Lord tells him, it's okay for you to go to Egypt. So though God has sanctioned this, the Canaan space is where God wants them. They're supposed to be here. Egypt is obviously not Canaan space. And anytime, as we have asked and answered the question before, when God's people are taken away from the place he wants them to a place where they do not ultimately belong, that story arc or that journey would be called a what? An exile. The family is exiled, and it ultimately started with this negative catalyst of trying to kill Joseph. But what are some of the final words that Joseph says to the corpus of his brothers who come to him trembling in fear after the death of their father, thinking that now's the time, the hammer's going to fall, he's going to exact his vengeance. And he says, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. In other words, at this point, Moses has been laying the seedbed for this all along, and we haven't perhaps picked up on it, but now we do, because it really crescendos and becomes all the more clear with Joseph's declarative statement. That in all of these things, because that's what Moses has been doing, is putting this together, one story sequence after another, to show that man's boneheaded choices in his conscious rebellion against God and flubbing up God's intended design, yet he takes that consequence and he turns it for good. Not so that they continue to come out clean and unscathed. They still have perhaps negative consequences to deal with, but still, God in his mercy renews and he redeems. You ever thought about the idea that maybe, even though this is the first book for us, when Moses actually started putting pen to papyrus, writing these things down, that Genesis might not have been the first book? We have no idea what sequence he wrote these things in. To me, the logical sequencing would be starting with Exodus, your own story. Wouldn't you agree? Maybe perhaps by the end of the wilderness wanderings, and I ain't got nothing but time out there in the desert when there's not a whole awful lot else to do, maybe formulating the story that would become Genesis, maybe it was something he did later on in life. And I say that simply because when you read through the text of Deuteronomy, what you have is a rendition of the entire history of the last 40 years and this new Adam as a nation flubbing up God's intended plan, which was to carry them right on into the new provincial Eden space right after they got out of Egypt. But that turned into 40 years of wandering. And if he's got to give a swan song, which is not simply just Deuteronomy, could also be Genesis and saying, here's a legacy to leave you with, an understanding we come from a long line of people, all the way back to Adam, who flubbed it up. But yet God has been merciful. He is renewed. He is redeemed, even from the beginning. Going further with this theme of glimpsing Messiah, go with me to Genesis 39. We'll briefly read the first 6 verses. Genesis 39. Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guards, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. From the time that he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was on all that he owned, in his house and in his fields. He left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. If we're being honest, I think we would have to agree, this is a little odd. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, where else in the stories that we've seen so far or that we've read has God just prospered someone because another person was in their house? We've had moments like Melchizedek coming out to bless Abraham, but we've had nothing like this. We've had a chance where Abraham as he was still Abram then, in the presence of the Pharaoh, he deceived in lying about the status of the woman who was his wife, but he said sister, and he was blessed by receiving flocks and herds and male and female servants, and his wealth exponentially multiplied. But he was blessed. Pharaoh didn't get anything but the raw end of the deal on that one. Total inversion of this. Joseph is getting a promotion, but he doesn't get any extra wealth because of this. Why in the world does Potiphar, who is not a God-fearing man, at least in the form of Yahweh, no doubt he is probably a loyal, obedient servant to the gods of Egypt, but certainly not to the God that Joseph worships, and probably finds it somewhat peculiar that he worships only one God. Who does such a thing, right? And yet his house is blessed. Everything that this man's touch lands on quintessentially turns to gold. Remember this. This is what's going on in the story. Back in Genesis chapter 2. In this sacred space that God puts the first coronated king, ordained priest in, the idea is that blessing is going to flow from this place. We didn't get a chance to really dive into this so much, but these aren't throwaway words or phrases either when Moses is giving us the geographical representation of what surrounds the garden. These rivers that branch off from the one that flows from the garden and flows toward the nations, such as Egypt, reference there of the river that flows toward Cush, which lies directly south of Egypt, more than likely. The Gihon that flows right toward Jerusalem, and the Tigris and Euphrates that wraps itself around the nations of Babylon. Of course, the other ancient kingdoms such as Akkad and Sumer, and even Assyria further off to the north, which is mentioned in the text. Why are those things given to us? Because the idea is that the blessings of Eden, this divine image bearer that God has put there that's supposed to fill this space with more image bearers and share with them the wisdom and glory of God, and the world by virtue of that, as God has told him to subdue this creation, to bring order and complexity to it upon what God has already instilled. That's the idea, is Eden blessing is flowing to the nations. Think about what the psalmist says in Psalm 1 as he alludes to the image of the garden. How happy is the one who doesn't do all those other things, but for sake of space, I've just cut that short. Instead, his delight is in the Lord's instruction. He meditates on it day and night. He is like a tree planted beside still flowing streams that bears its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and whatever he does prospers. And here, this is what we kind of get a picture of, is it not? Potiphar, the chief authoritative figure in this particular portion of the story, has positioned this man exactly where he wants him, and everything that Joseph does prospers. What is this alluding to as far as the bigger story? The idea of an image bearer in a place designated for him, and everything he does prospers. Why? Because he is walking in the wisdom and light of God's counsel. There's no dialogue going on here between God and Joseph that we have record of, but nonetheless, one could presume easily that's the case because God is blessing and prospering as opposed to somehow punishing Joseph. Moving on with that. In Genesis 2 also, we have, as this story progresses through Genesis 39, remember what happens in the story. I got the verse reference wrong. It should be Genesis 3. Forgive me for anybody out there who is watching this later on and notices that. The serpent, this craftily subtle creature, winds up coming to the woman and says, "Did God really say?" "No, you certainly won't die." Well, think about what's going on here. The woman ultimately winds up taking from the fruit. She gives it to her husband. They eat, they fail, they consciously rebel. Here we have Joseph in this place, prospering. The Lord is blessing him. In other words, the functionality of what the ideal picture of Genesis 1 and 2 is working here in this scenario of Joseph and Potiphar's house. And by extension, Potiphar representing the nations is benefiting from that. So the whole thing is moving in the right direction. What would we expect to show up in the story then if you consider Genesis 3 on the heels of Genesis 2? The serpent. Who is that taking the form of in the story so far? You've got it. He's in Potiphar's house. Who jumps in to bring the wife? And what does the serpent do in the garden? Did God really say? No, you won't die. She's looking at the man. She appreciates his form. She wants him badly. She offers herself to him. She demands that he sleep with her on multiple occasions. She attempts to just wear him down and eventually seizes him and demands it face to face. And then, As opposed to just giving in, he runs away. He flees. Remember what God said as one of the few momentary glimmers of hope in the Genesis 3 portion of the story. After the man and the woman have rebelled and they've fallen, their eyes are opened. But yet God, in spite of the consequences dealt, says that between the woman's seed and the serpent's seed, there will be constant war. But the seed of the woman will prevail in crushing the head of the serpent. Now, when we read that, we want to jump immediately to Jesus, the cross, the resurrection, and that's not wrong. But if we just skip over the rest of all of that lies in between and fail to see the moments, the big triumphant moments, they pale in comparison to the cross, don't get me wrong. But the big triumphant moments where the image bearer in the center of the story is actually doing what he or she is supposed to be doing, and they have this moment like the garden that arises, and they succeed. This is a serpent squashing moment. And this is exactly what's happening here. But it doesn't quite end well, does it? Instead of him being somehow rewarded by virtue of this, he's cast into prison. But before we get there, this Messiah-like figure in Joseph is one that battles against the sultriness of the serpent's offer, wielding a blow to its head, but suffering comes all the same. So we'll take a look at that now as we get into these other dream sequences that come. So turn with me, if you will, to Genesis 40, and we're going to read verses 8 through 23. We had dreams, they said, but there's no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph. In my dream, there was a vine in front of me. On the vine, there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms came out and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. This is its interpretation, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. In just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand the way you used to when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well for you, remember that I was with you. Please show kindness to me by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should put me in the dungeon. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was positive, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. 3 baskets of white bread were on my head. In the top basket were all sorts of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is its interpretation, Joseph replied. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from off you and hang you on a tree. Then the birds will eat the flesh from your body. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he gave a feast for all of his servants. He elevated the chief cupbearer and the chief baker amongst his servants, literally meaning lifted the heads up on. Pharaoh restored the chief cupbearer to his position as cupbearer, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But Pharaoh hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had explained to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He instead forgot him. So this is what we have. Just a general rundown. I don't have to really elaborate for you on the screen what's going on there, because as we see, patterning this after what the slide I showed you earlier, or the previous dream sequence, it's pretty much the same thing. Understand, just as an interpretive rule, this is apocalypse. When you and I think apocalypse, if zombies and nuclear bombs are the first things that jump into our minds, we have totally got a 21st century Hollywoodized version of what apocalypse means that has no place in biblical narrative at all. In any sort of biblical writing or extra-biblical writing, usually Jewish and maybe early Christian era apocalyptic writings. They may have to do with the end of the world, and there can be rather fiery sequences of judgment involved. But the general idea behind it, this word, both in Hebrew and Greek, is just simply this: unveiling, pulling the curtain back on, showing what is hidden now to be revealed and exposed. This is exactly it, correct? These guys have dreams. They're distressed. Nobody can interpret them, and they are troubled by virtue of that. Joseph, by extension of God's Spirit working through him, pulls back the cover of what these mean and show them that this is Apocalypse 101. You need to get that, because it will show up again in this story before we leave. All right, but what this ultimately boils down to is this: God alone is the one who unveils the unknown. He guides his image bearer to wisely discern his words. This is important. And also to discern between good and evil. If you think about that in general, you've got 2 men. Cupbearer, he squeezes grapes. He has juice that comes from it. He gives it to Pharaoh. he gets restored to his position. If we had to put it in one of two categories, good, evil, where would you throw that? Good. They said good if you're watching out there. They're a little shy. If you have the baker who's got bread and it gets eaten up by the birds and he's told that that's ultimately going to be his dead carcass that's delivered up to the birds to eat, would you consign that to good or evil? So if we have good, we have evil, and we have God's image bearer discerning between the two, where does this take us back to? There we are. Genesis chapter 3. This is the tree that you can't eat of, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Why does God not want them to be able to discern between good and evil? He does. But who's the one that has the authority to set the parameters on that? God. Who is it that Joseph said has the ability to divulge dreams? Not his own machinations. It's God. God is the one who provides said wisdom. As the story goes on into the next chapter, Genesis 41, if you'll read with me there, we'll read 25 through 36. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dream means the same thing. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams mean the same thing. The 7 thin, sickly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind are 7 years of famine. It's just as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. After them, 7 years of famine will take place, and the abundance of the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The famine will devastate the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because of the famine that follows it, for the famine will be very severe. Since the dream was given twice to Pharaoh, it means the matter has been determined by God, and he will carry it out soon. So now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man, a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Let them gather all the excess food during these good years that are coming. Under Pharaoh's authority, store the grain in the cities so that they may preserve it as food. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. Then the country will not be wiped out by the famine. Ultimately, through this second giving of an apocalyptic vision, now it's Pharaoh in his doublet of dreams. God's image bearer is ideally the one who sees the will of God in the affairs of those around him. Get this. We've had some prophecy given so far in this book, beginning in Genesis 12. God is going to make a great nation of this man, Abram, who he has entered into covenant relationship with. He's promised kings will come from him. He will be the father of many nations, and some way, somehow, this family is going to bless all the nations of the world. Then later on, in another vision that he has in Genesis 15, he is told that his descendants coming after him will somehow be subjugated in a land that isn't their own, oppressed by the people who are native to that land. They will become the recipients of God's judgment, and God will bring his people out of there, but they will be there for at least enough time for 4 generations to pass. How? When? No answers to any of this. But Joseph, as God's image bearer, is not one who is seeking further divine revelation through the giving of more prophecy. Even with respect to these apocalyptic visions, he sees what God is doing, and he discerns that as being the signs of the times, and he gives decisive instructions on what needs to happen. Jesus is doing the same thing when you consider the content of Matthew 23 and 4, Mark 13, Luke 21, or even other smaller prophetic sequences with respect to this concept and dichotomy of judgment, repentance, and the benefit or consequence of either course that is taken. Ultimately, what's going on here is between the idea of 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, good, evil, yet again, God's image bearer discerning what is good, what is evil. And Pharaoh ultimately surmises that this is a good plan. If you think about it, in this whole diorama, it's as if to say that Pharaoh, in a sense, is parallel to God, and this Messiah-like figure is one who is going to rule in conjunction with him, sharing in that authority, and the only one who is greater than him is Pharaoh. The only one who is greater than the image-bearer coronated king in Genesis 1 is who? God. The parallels continue on. As God reflects back on creation and says that it is all, so when Pharaoh hears Joseph's plan, that he is supposed to appoint a wise man and overseers and do all these things, what does Pharaoh ultimately surmise about Joseph's plan? That it's a good plan. This anticipates leaders such as David, Solomon, even Daniel. It's not coincidental that when we jump into Daniel chapter 2, this is almost the exact same thing we see with respect to the interplay between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. And the same assessment by both kings, Pharaoh and the emperor of Babylon, that this man has housed within him the spirit of the gods. Identifying some more patterns, kind of carrying along this concept of Adam and Joseph. We've already talked about, God coronating Adam as vice regent over creation. Joseph gets the same thing. Adam is dependent upon God for his knowledge of good and evil. Joseph is dependent upon Pharaoh for his appraisal of what is good. God makes Adam in his image, giving him the authority to rule. What happens after Pharaoh exalts Joseph? He takes his signet ring off, puts it on Joseph's finger. That bears the image and sign of authority or seal of Pharaoh, so that anything that Joseph stamps that on is as if it was said or written by Pharaoh himself. God gives Adam a wife to rule and to serve as co-priest. These might be coincidental details, but I'm reluctant to think so, that right after we have this bestowal of a gold necklace and the giving of Pharaoh's signet ring, then Pharaoh is the one who finds Joseph a wife, and she just happens to be the daughter of the priest who serves in On. But of course, with Adam fails to discern properly, given God's command, but yet Joseph does. The human here, the son of Adam, succeeds in discerning, and he redeems what's lost. If in anything, at this portion of the story, it's like we're getting a chance to look back at Genesis 1 through 3 and see a picture of what could have been had the flip side of the coin actually been what happened, obedience of Adam versus his rebellion, versus what is still yet to come and what can still be, albeit in some limited way, for the duration of the future of these characters. All right. So I'm going to have to curtail some of the passages I was going to read and not read them in full scope, but I'll just tell you generally what particular section I'm working in. This comes in Genesis 42, when we're now working with Joseph and his brothers, as his brothers now, for the first time, come down to Egypt. So, what happens when Joseph's brothers wind up coming to Egypt and they dialogue with him? Of course, they're speaking through an interpreter. They have no idea he understands in Hebrew or whatnot. As soon as they talk to him and he sees them, he comes immediately to accuse them of being what? Spies. Exactly, spies. And they try to tell him, no, we are all the son of one man, and we are 12 brothers, but one is not, and one is back home with his father. No, he insists, you are absolutely spies. And this particular portion of the story ends with Joseph locking up all three of his brothers. Now, we could surmise at this point that Joseph is simply doing this purely out of vengeance, that he's letting his temper get the better of him, and those would be right conclusions to at least attempt to come to, but we have to let the text drive us. Because we remember in verse 9 that Joseph, when he saw his brothers and heard them speak to him, he remembers the dreams that he had about them. So in asking the question, is he motivated by vengeance? I would think that if the answer is yes, then his end would merely be to punish them. There would be no extension of mercy in any of this. That he would want to torture them to the utmost degree so that they can feel something of what he had felt over all those long years, locked away in rat-infested, plague-infested prison for nothing that he had done, all because of what they chose to do to him. But if not motivated by vengeance, then perhaps his end would be to reveal what is ultimately in their heart. This is what winds up coming as a byproduct of that. Later on, when Joseph wants to lock them up and then tells them first, one brother can go and all the rest of you can stay here, and that brother will go back to your native homeland and bring the brother that you left there. Then he locks them up in prison. They dialogue amongst each other, and Reuben is the one who says, obviously, we are being punished for what we did to our brother. We saw his deep distress when he pleaded with us, but we would not listen, and this is why trouble has come upon us. And when Joseph hears this, he's immediately moved. He has to turn away from, maybe even leave their presence, because he can't control himself. Tears just start flowing down his face. Does that sound like a man who's motivated by vengeance? Wouldn't think so. But then after 3 days, he comes to them saying, I fear Yahweh, and I will relent. I will do this instead. He offers that all of them, with the exception of one of their choosing, can go, take grain back to their families, relieve their suffering, and then come back to take this brother out of captivity once they bring the brother that they left behind. Either way, this is what we're stuck with. It's a brother who rescues brothers. It sets up a pattern for what is going to be the big reveal at the end of this when Joseph finally takes off the crown and he reveals himself as Joseph, their brother, who they sold for slavery and intended to kill ultimately, who they thought was dead, but is indeed alive. A brother who rescues brothers, a life in exchange for lives. Glimpsing Messiah more. God working through these unclear schemes. So, why does Joseph give their silver back to them? Does he want to just feast on their torturous screams when the moment comes when they've left the land and they tear open their sacks and they realize, oh my goodness, the silver is still here. They're going to think that we stole it. They're going to attempt to try to kill us. Does he just want to play a prank on them to see them shaking their boots? I think this is where we perhaps need to pay a little attention, better attention to what's going on here. Each man presents a bag of silver for a bag of grain. In essence, the bag of silver was the value of his own life. That's what everybody is giving in exchange for grain. I need grain because I want to live. I don't want to become a victim of the famine. So this is what the price is. I'm giving you what I can in exchange for that. This is what I have to do in order for me to survive. In essence now, the brothers owe Joseph their lives by virtue of the fact they are coming to him. They want grain. They are willing to pay for it. A subplot we hear would be that, in essence, they are kind of giving their lives in exchange for the life that they took. I'm going to expound on that here in just a bit. But anyway, the giving of the silver back was, in essence, a way of returning their lives to them. This begins to set up a pattern for us that will take greater meaning once we get to places like Exodus, certainly deep in the heart of Leviticus, where we start to read through texts where, okay, so you need to take a census. All the Levites, they are going to be given over in exchange for all the firstborn that I had consecrated and redeemed on the night of the 10th plague in Egypt. How many firstborn are there? How many sons of Levi are there? The numbers don't match. There are more firstborn amongst the tribes of Israel. So what will you do? You will pay in silver this particular price for every life that we do not have in this discrepancy to make up for how many firstborn are not present amongst the Levites. The same thing will come when you want to redeem a parcel of land that has been sold. You must redeem it in silver. If you make a vow, if you want to redeem that by virtue of you can't pay the vow, you can't do however much time of service you've indebted yourself to, if you want to redeem the time you have left, you have to do so in silver. Silver becomes the currency of redemption. Anytime something is going to be taken back or bought back, it is done so by virtue of silver exchanging hands. So if you're seeing the sequence here, what's going on is these brothers are coming with lives in hand, giving life to the person who holds all the grain, saying, please sustain our life by virtue of giving us grain. We give you silver, and he has given them the silver back. If the silver is their life, what has he done? He's given them their lives back. As we see the deeper subplot in all of this, we know that the brothers are guilty. We, the readers, with the third-person vantage point, have all the knowledge as all the cards are laid out for us. We know what at this point the brothers do not know, and that is Joseph's alive. They think he's dead. He's the one pulling all the strings here. What is he ultimately trying to tell them? And they certainly wouldn't know this at this moment in the story because they don't know who he is. But once they know who he is, post-declaration of Genesis 50 of what you meant for evil, God meant for good, I'm going to take care of you and your children, they can reflect back on this and understand that's what he was doing. When he knew who we were, but we didn't know who he was giving us our lives back. After all, this is what his servant says when they come back the second time and they try to clear this up real quick before they go in to share a meal with this man. They're afraid and terrified they're going to become the man's slaves. Hey, when we left here, when we stopped to camp to get a little bit of grain out for our animals and ourselves, we realized our silver was still in our sacks. So we brought that back and we brought more silver for more grain. And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. May you be well. Don't be afraid. Your God and the God of your father must have put treasure in your sacks. because I received your silver. That's one of the greatest subplots in all of this. In spite of the treachery of Joseph's brothers, yet God blesses anyway. In spite of the treachery of Abraham, who lied and deceived and manipulated Pharaoh, God blessed anyway. Only a God who deals in the currency of mercy to whom he will have mercy does such things. Working through more of the unclear schemes. We go back to the sequence in Genesis 37 where his brothers say, so come on now, let's kill him. Throw him in one of the pits. They make a hasty vow that in essence threatens Joseph's life. And notice what happens when they bring the news back to Jacob. He tears his clothes. He puts ashes on. He dons sackcloth. He mourns over the loss of his son. Well, now when we have the second sequence of them coming to Egypt, and when they leave, they have something else. All the silver plus Joseph's special cup. Joseph sends his steward out there. He meets them out there in the wilderness, overtaking them, and they're like, what's the meaning of all this? And he's like, why would you repay evil for good? Is that yet also not one of the existential themes that's going on all throughout this entire book? From Genesis 3, in spite of what God has done for the first pair of image bearers, yet they repay evil for good, and so on and so on. But that aside, what do you mean repay evil for good? You've obviously stolen my master's cup that he uses for divination. No way. This is crazy. In fact, I challenge you, find it amongst whoever you can here. And if you find that cup in any man's sack, that man will be your slave. In fact, we'll all be your slaves, and that man should die. A hasty vow threatens not only Benjamin's life, because we know it's in his sack, and theirs as well, because now they're going to have to be this man's slaves for the rest of their lives. That means no going back to Canaan. That means no fulfillment of Abraham's promise in Canaan, because now they're going to be someone else's property forever. And when the search is on and he gets to Benjamin's sack and out comes spilling the cup, they do the same thing that Jacob did. They tear their clothes. Yet another hasty vow has left them in destruction and ruin and completely helpless, because there's nothing they can do about this. They pronounced death sentence on the man who owns the cup. And this was the one brother who, above all, they were vowing the lives of their children and even themselves. Reuben said, kill my 2 sons if I don't bring him back. Judah says, you can hold me personally accountable if he does not come back to you whole. And then when they finally get brought back into Joseph's presence, look what is said. Just like it was said to the woman in Genesis 3, what have you done? To Cain in Genesis 4, what have you done? So now Joseph, standing in the picture or frame as God almost, looking at them saying, what have you done? And ultimately it leads us to this. It's a battling back and forth of this concept of living and dying. I'm not going to read all these passages for you, but I'll read a couple of them. It starts in Genesis 42 with this declaration in going down to Egypt and the purpose behind it. Jacob saying to his sons, I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there, buy some for us, so that we will live and not die. Live and not die. Later on in the passage, this is what Joseph says once he has decided to release these brothers after 3 days in prison. I fear God, do this, and you will live. Bring your youngest brother to me so that your words can be confirmed. Then you won't die. One more, Genesis 43, verse 8. Then Judah said to his father Israel, send the boy with me. We will be on our way so that we may live and not die, neither we nor you nor our dependents. Why in all of these passages there's so much emphasis on this concept of life and death? This is what the whole story has been about from the opening pages and the first paragraphs. God, the life bringer, has set everything up exactly the way it needs to be to sustain the crowning jewel of creation, and that is the man, woman, together, imaging humanity and God as king, queen, priests. God has chosen to sustain them with life, but they've opted for death. That's the way the rest of the story continues on as the trajectory gains momentum. And now, before the story ends in this beautiful synopsis of what God's kingdom is supposed to look like and how it's going to function in this earthly realm, it's this battling back and forth of choosing life over death. That's going to be exactly how Moses sums up the Torah in his final address to Israel. That is the month-long sermon series of the book of Deuteronomy. Choose life, not death. that's meant to go back to this particular story sequence and remember our patriarchs and the examples set by both their successes and their awful failings. And the concluding words of Joseph in chapter 50, that God planned it for good. And it's not ironic, or I should say it's not coincidental, that some of the opening things that God declares in the first pages of Scripture after he surveys all of creation is that it is good. And in spite of all the evil interjected in every single story sequence that we have up until the conclusion of Genesis 50, the final thing that we have said about God's assessment of all that has happened is that God has planned it for good. Well, we already talked about this with respect to the heir apparent between Reuben and Judah, so I'm going to skip over that. And in summary, I'm just going to simply say this. This story gives us exactly what we have in Genesis 12. The promise of going from your land and your relatives and your father's house to a land I will show you, and I'll make you into a great nation. And I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. That in this place, as the story draws to a close with God's people having migrated now from Canaan into Egypt, we have God's image bearer ruling over God's people. He is also working to subdue the land. Think of the content of Genesis 45. We've got this whole story about how as the famine continues to wane on, Joseph is able effectively to consolidate all of Egypt under Pharaoh's power. Why does Moses give us any of this detail about the people coming and saying, okay, so we will give you our silver for grain. Please don't let us die. After all the silver runs out, we'll give you our land so that we won't die. Please don't let us die. Give us grain. We don't have anything else except for our bodies. We will become Pharaoh's slaves. Please don't let us die. And at the end of it, Joseph has consolidated the entire kingdom solely for Pharaoh. What does this teach us of Messiah? Everything that was lost by virtue of Adam's fall and forfeiture of what was rightly his, by virtue of his coronation as king, is what Messiah is supposed to consolidate and bring back under the federal headship of God's kingdom. He's supposed to subdue the earth. That's exactly what we find in the very language given in Joshua, where it is said that the land was subdued before them after the phases of the conquest is over with. That's the idea, is bringing it back into under the authority of God's kingdom. And of course, God's image bearer is working to bless the nations because all the lands were affected by this. We only have record of Canaan, but by virtue of these inhabitants who are descendants of Abraham coming down to seek grain. But it's all the lands affected. So we're thinking about the kingdoms off to the west of Put and Lydia. And we also have the kingdoms to the south of Cush, or modern-day Ethiopia, Somalia. The Nubians, the longtime rivals, but neighbors directly to the south of the Egyptians and whatnot. And who knows who all was graciously benefited by virtue of God's sovereign plan to work to save not only Egypt, but everyone who came seeking refuge, and the grain that they heard was there for them to purchase. And so we have God's image bearer ruling over God's people, blessing the nations in a space that God had carved out for them as he has given them the best of the land. And that's where we end this story before we jump on in to Exodus. All right, so we've got some time left. Any questions about what we've covered tonight?
Why is it like Joseph is like one of the least mentioned characters in the New Testament when his story screams
Jesus everywhere, right?
I mean, like he doesn't have like if I was a reader of the Bible back then, I would be like, this guy is Messiah. Like he doesn't do anything wrong, and he's the firstborn of Rachel. He's all of the things that should be Messiah. So like, why does like no New Testament author really pick up on that?
And so, what I would argue in juxtaposition against that is that the New Testament authors are picking up on this. Because one thing that the New Testament authors are all anticipating is that every one of those people who are reading these stories are Jews and are deeply steeped in the meaning behind what is the value of the stories that they have all learned from childhood in Hebrew school. And maybe further in Bet Midrash if they decided to dedicate a portion of their life to deeper study after Hebrew school or Torah school. And so because of that, they can set or lay down lots of different kernels or seeds that allude directly to this story sequence without saying the name of Joseph. But certainly, if you consider the idea of Second Temple literature. Second Temple literature, as far as the period itself, begins about 500 BC, because that's when the people have come back to the land and they've been there for a little while. And certainly within a century or two, we're going to pick up a lot more as goes the steam and the momentum behind the literary contribution of that particular time period of the Jewish occupation of the land. And a lot of people are wrestling with these concepts, wondering about if Messiah is supposed to come. This is the time with us being restored to the land. But clearly, as Daniel has said, we are still locked away in exile because Messiah does not rule yet. That son of the descendant of David has not yet come. But how do we reconcile places like Isaiah 53 that clearly speak to the idea of him dying, be it Psalm 2 and Daniel 7 speak to him the idea, and especially passages of Zechariah, like Zechariah 12. He is going to descend upon the Mount of Olives, and when his feet touch the ground, the mountain is going to completely cleave in two, and a portion will move here and there. The temple is going to be built, and Ezekiel speaks about this concept of a river flowing and all these things, and even the nations will come to join in it, those who survive the conflagration when Messiah goes to battle against all the nations gathered against Jerusalem, per Zechariah's scroll. How does all this fit in the lifetime of one person? So it gave rise to the idea of there being two Messiahs. Messiah ben Joseph, ben meaning son, and Messiah ben David. And even now, according to Kabbalistic and even, that's more mystical, but even rabbinical Jewish lines of thinking, as goes Messiah's advent, that's still a very prevalent line of thinking. In fact, you can go to kabod.org and look up every article you want on Messiah. This is strictly Jewish, full Messianic, but not Messianic Judaism in the idea that they are followers of Jesus. They are not. In fact, they have polemic articles against why Jesus can't be Messiah. But they still speak along this line of thinking. Rabbis are still writing to this day about the idea that there will have to be two Messiahs. This cannot possibly be all in the picture of one. And that the Messiah who descends from Joseph because of Joseph's suffering, even though they seem to totally forget the conquering sequence in that he ascends and is exalted to king status, but because he suffers so unjustly, that fits the Isaiah 53 mold, that Messiah will be the one that dies. But the Messiah ben David will be the one who conquers and who comes to consolidate the nations, reunite all the tribes of Israel in the land, build this Ezekiel temple, and ultimately usher in a never-ending kingdom era full of prosperity for God's covenant people through Abraham. So, having said that, though, it's there. Clearly, you can see that in the suffering sequences of Jesus in the gospel narrative itself. I mean, after all, why in the world even draw attention to the detail of how much silver Judas betrayed him for? Why does that matter? If it was 1 or 50 coins, but the idea that, and even though it doesn't match number-wise, the concept of him being betrayed in such a way. It would have been enough to simply say that Judas was the one who orchestrated this, but the idea that money exchanges hands, blood money, the price for a life, that clearly alludes back to Joseph. And then the same concept too with respect to Matthew and the way that Matthew is just amalgamating so many different story sequences from the Old Testament narrative. There's a lot of Moses in there, but before we even get there, we've got the fact that Joseph is given to us as Jesus' stepfather, and the only thing that's really said about him outside of the fact that he's a carpenter is that he has what? Dreams. At first, he doesn't want to believe Mary. I mean, he's not willing to have her consigned to death by stoning, but he doesn't want to believe her, and he wants to divorce her. But it's the angel Gabriel who comes and says that what she has spoken is true. He doesn't have a vision, he has a dream. And then when the time comes when perhaps a year or two later, and Herod is sending his soldiers to destroy and ravage the little tiny town of Bethlehem and kill every toddler under the age of 2, who is it that receives word, you need to get out of here and get out of here now? And where is it that they wind up going? Why doesn't Luke give us the same sequence, or Mark or John for that matter? Why is he the one that tells us so that the words of Hosea could be fulfilled? Out of Egypt I have called my son. That whole sequence is Joseph's story. So it's there. And it's meant to pull these threads together and to weave them into the three-dimensional tapestry of who Messiah is, and bringing to bear these bigger questions that have been looming large for centuries, and that is, how in the world can this one person be a human, and yet so much is said about him that is almost God-like status? I mean, Psalm 110, verse 1, the most frequently quoted Old Testament verse throughout the New Testament. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. How can somebody besides God be greater than David? That doesn't make any sense. And yet somehow this person is supposed to share in the same similar vein as Joseph. Any other questions?
On the scripture you got up there about if you bless for those that bless it will be blessed, and those that curse will be cursed. I think that's equally applicable today.
Oh, yes. In fact, the whole reason why it's important for us to get this in the first place is because all of this is setting us up for what the expectation of kingdom ideology and theology is for the New Testament. Much of us have a tendency to relegate this concept of kingdom strictly to the future. I don't know why I was trying to draw a 7 or whatever, but strictly to the future, in that nothing of what we're experiencing now is necessarily kingdom, but there is so much New Testament language that completely refutes that concept and turns that on its head. But then, as many are willing to admit that, but yet still try to hold strongly to the idea of consummated kingdom being the ideal. Revelation 21 and 22, closing chapters of history, not just the Bible. But there are many who contend with that as well and draw our focus and attention back to the idea of what is the concept of kingdom now, with Jesus ruling and reigning cosmically at the right hand of the Father. If Daniel 7, in that image of the cloud rider God, but yet in this humanoid fashion, ascending unto God in the clouds and receiving God's authority to rule at his side on these thrones that are arrayed around him, one is at his right hand. Because this is where Jesus ascends to and is told to us clearly by Stephen, who sees him standing at the right hand of the Father in his final moments of breath before he closes his eyes. If all of that is to say that kingdom has been bestowed, and according to Daniel, that is a dominion and a kingdom that will never end, never lapse. Okay, if we have entered into the ideal picture of what God intended all along in Genesis 1 and 2, then what is that agenda for us now? Many will say as a detractor, well, because there is still crime and affliction and death and suffering, disease, we are obviously not living in the ideal state. The concept of an ideal state is foreign to Scripture. In other words, when that time comes and Jesus returns, will be the end of all of that ministry. There will be no working to promote mercy and grace and bring people into the covenant family of God and expand kingdom and temple, because it will have reached its furthest point of fruition. The tree will have grown to the point where all of its branches have blossomed and bloomed. There will be no more room for expansion. His kingdom will come to occupy the whole world, and forever it will be. But we have a kingdom mission and agenda, which the kingdom mission and agenda in the ideal state of Genesis 1 and 2 was not static. In other words, it wasn't relegated simply to the box space of the garden. It was meant to go. We're going to crack open this thing. We're going to take it out in the trajectory the 4 rivers go and carry it out to the nations that don't even exist yet, but will, per the story. And that's what we are to do. When Jesus closes Matthew's gospel and he says, all authority is given unto me in heaven and on earth, wink, wink, that's Daniel 7. Isaiah 9, go. That is Joshua's command to these people, this generation of Israelites who are going to carry on this legacy after him when he dies. And he says, there are still pockets of the land with Canaanites left in it. Go and take that. That's what he means. Go and take what is yet to be conquered for the sake of the kingdom. If we're not rolling those pictures, those themes, those ideas into the gospel narrative, I think we pretty much missed the entire point of the Old Testament in and of itself. And of course, those stories start here and now. So, Mr. Stanley, you could not have been more correct in your assessment. Anything else? All right. Well, next week we will start to tackle Exodus.
What was your question from last week?